Close your eyes and let the modern world fade away. Imagine for a moment that we have stepped back 2,000 years into the heart of the Roman Empire. The noise of the 21st century, the hum of electricity, the notification sounds, the traffic is gone. In its place is a stillness, broken only by the natural sounds of a pre-industrial world, the wind rustling through cypress trees, the distant bleating of sheep on a hillside, and the soft, rhythmic sound of a loom clicking back and forth in a quiet room. We are here to talk about clothing, not the fast fashion of today, which changes with the seasons and is discarded just as quickly, but clothing that was built to last, clothing that carried the weight of tradition, law, and social order. In ancient Rome, what you wore was not merely a choice of style, it was a declaration of who you were. It was a language spoken in folds of fabric, in the specific shade of a dye, and in the length of a hem. But before we can understand the complex language of togas and stolas, we must first understand the silence of the material itself. The foundation of the Roman wardrobe was wool, lana. It was the fabric of the empire. While the wealthy might import soft linens from Egypt, or on very rare occasions, shimmering silk from the far reaches of the East, for the vast majority of Romans, life was wrapped in wool. Imagine the texture of it. It is not the processed, chemically softened wool we might know today. This is raw, honest wool. It has a presence. It has a smell, a faint, oily scent of lanolin that never quite leaves the fiber, reminding the wearer of the flock from which it came. In the cooler months, the wool is heavy and dense, trapping the heat of the body against the skin. In the summer, it is lighter, woven with a looser hand, but it is still wool. It can be scratchy. It is substantial. When a Roman man or woman dressed in the morning, they felt the weight of their clothing. It was a tactile reminder of their existence. The fabric did not just sit on the body, it interacted with it. It absorbed the moisture of a hot afternoon in the Forum. It repelled the light drizzle of a gray autumn day in Gaul. Let us look closely at the most basic garment of all, the tunic, the tunica. Every Roman, from the lowest slave working in the fields to the emperor sitting on the Palatine Hill, wore a tunic. It was the second skin of Rome. To sleep, you might wear a tunic. To work, you wore a tunic. Underneath the heavy, majestic toga, there was always the tunic. Visually, the tunic is incredibly simple. It is remarkably unexciting, which is why it is the perfect place to start our rest. Imagine two rectangular pieces of cloth. They are not shaped to the body. There are no darts, no fitted waists, no complex tailoring. They are simply two rectangles woven on a vertical loom. The loom itself is a mesmerizing tool, a frame of wood where threads are pulled taut, creating a grid of tension. The weaver passes the shuttle back and forth, over and under, hour after hour, day after day. The result is a sturdy, plain weave. These two rectangles are sewn together. The stitching is functional, done with a bone or bronze needle and thick thread. The sides are closed up, leaving spaces for the arms. The top is sewn shut, leaving a space for the head. That is it. That is the tunica. It is a T-shape, although often the sleeves were just the natural drape of the wide fabric falling over the shoulders. When a Roman man pulled this garment over his head, it would hang loose, perhaps down to his knees or mid-calves. It was a shapeless sack of wool. But the transformation happened with the cingulum, the belt. A simple leather strap or a woven cord was tied around the waist. The fabric was then pulled up through the belt, blousing over it, creating a fold of material that hung down. This allowed the wearer to adjust the length. For a man, the proper length was crucial. It was a rule of unspoken geometry. The hem should fall exactly to the knee. Not above it. That was for soldiers or laborers who needed freedom of movement. Not below it. That was considered effeminate or a sign of laziness. The knee was the standard. The front of the tunic might be slightly shorter than the back, creating a subtle angle. There was no zipper. There were no buttons. You did not step into it. You dove into it. You emerged from the neck hole, adjusting the heavy wool on your shoulders. If it was cold, you did not put on a coat. You simply put on another tunic, and then perhaps another. The Emperor Augustus, known for his frail health, was said to wear 4 tunics in the winter, layer upon layer of wool, creating a thick barrier against the chill of the marble palace. Imagine the feeling of wearing this, the friction of the wool against your neck, the tightness of the belt at your waist, the draft of air on your legs. It is a sensation of being grounded. The tunic is practical. It is the color of the sheep it came from, off-white, cream, perhaps a dusty gray or brown if the wool was left undyed for a worker. It is the color of nature. It absorbs the light rather than reflecting it. There is a calmness in this uniformity. If you were to walk down a street in Rome at dawn before the chaos of the day began, you would see figures emerging from their homes, all silhouetted in this same basic shape. The tunica, a draped rectangle, a belted waist, a knee-length hem, a silent uniform of the ancient world. As we drift deeper into this subject, we will explore the rules that governed this simple garment, the stripes that signaled power, the lengths that signaled gender, and the complex outer garments that covered it. But for now, hold on to this image, the rough, warm, imperfect weave of a woolen tunic, smelling faintly of the pasture, draped over the body, held fast by a leather belt. It is simple. It is timeless. It is the beginning of our history. The geometry of status, stripes, and dyes. We are still standing in the quiet stillness of the Roman morning. We are looking at the off-white wool of the basic tunic. It is a blank canvas. But in Rome, nothing remains blank for long. Even in the simplicity of a woolen sack, there is a code to be read, a visual language that tells you exactly where a person stands in the hierarchy of the world. Let your mind focus on the geometry of the tunic. Imagine the fabric draped over the shoulders. Now, visualize 2 vertical lines. These lines are woven directly into the fabric, or sometimes stitched on with great care. They run from the shoulder seam all the way down to the hem. They are parallel. They never touch. They are the clavi, the stripes. In the Roman world, these stripes were the primary indicators of a man's rank. They were not decorative in the sense that we think of patterns today. They were not there for artistic expression. They were there for classification. They were bureaucratic lines drawn on the body. Let us look at the first type of stripe, the angusticlavia, the narrow stripe. Imagine a tunic worn by a man of business, a man of means, perhaps a banker or a wealthy merchant who belongs to the equestrian order, the equites. On his tunic, the 2 purple stripes are thin. They are perhaps only an inch wide. They are subtle. They frame the torso. When he walks, the thin ribbons of purple move with him, flashing briefly as the fabric folds. They are dark, almost black in the dim light of indoors. but in the harsh Mediterranean sun, they reveal their reddish-purple hue. Now, compare this to the laticlavia, the broad stripe. This belongs to the senator. The stripes are wide, bold, and demanding of attention. They are 3 or 4 inches across, a heavy band of color running down the center of the chest. When a senator wears his tunic under his toga, that wide purple stripe is a beacon of authority. It consumes more dye. It requires more labor. It is a heavy, saturated line of power. Let us pause and think about this color. Purple. Purpura. In our modern world, purple is just a mix of red and blue. It is synthetic. It is cheap. It is everywhere. But in the time of the Caesars, purple was a living thing. It was not a mineral. It was organic. It came from the sea. To achieve the color of the clavi on these tunics, one needed the murex snail. These were small, predatory sea snails found in the waters of the Mediterranean. The process of extracting the color was slow, tedious, and incredibly smelly. It was not a job for the faint of heart. Imagine the dye factories in the city of Tyre. Huge vats of lead or tin bubbling over low fires, thousands upon thousands of crushed snail shells piling up in mounds. The glands of the snails were harvested, salted, and left to ferment in the sun for days. As they decomposed, they secreted a fluid. At first, it was a pale, yellowish cream color, but when exposed to the sunlight and the air, a chemical miracle occurred. It turned green, then blue, and finally a deep, rich, reddish purple. It took 10,000 snails to produce just a single gram of the highest quality dye. Just 1 gram. Think of the patience required, the slow collection of the snails, the waiting, the boiling, the skimming of the impurities from the surface of the vats, the dipping of the wool. The wool had to be soaked, dried, and soaked again to achieve the right saturation. The best purple, Tyrian purple, was said to look like the color of clotted blood. It was dark, shimmering, and iridescent. It did not fade in the sun. In fact, it was said that the sun only made it brighter and more intense. So, when you visualize the Roman senator walking slowly across the marble floor of the Curia, do not just see a stripe. See the thousands of hours of labor, the mountains of shells, and the chemical transformation of the sea that is draped across his shoulders. The tunic carries the weight of this industry, but not every moment in Rome was a moment of high status. There was also the tunica dissoluta, the loosened tunic. We spoke earlier of the belt, the cingulum, that held the tunic tight and high at the knee. But when the day was done, when the doors were locked and the oil lamps were lit in the private quarters of the domus, the belt was untied. Imagine the feeling of release. The wool, which had been bunched up around the waist, falls down. The hem drops from the knee to the ankle. The fabric hangs loose and shapeless. This was the attire of the home. It was the attire of rest. To be ungirded was to be off duty. It was a physical state of relaxation. There were also those who wore their tunics loose in public. But this was a dangerous signal. A man who walked through the streets with a loose, dragging tunic was seen as sloppy, perhaps dissolute in character, or aggressively counterculture. Julius Caesar, in his youth, was famously criticized for wearing his tunic loosely belted, a sign of his nonchalant arrogance and his refusal to conform to the strict rigidity of traditional Roman manners. But for the average citizen, the structure was comforting. You wake up. You put on the tunic. You ensure the stripes are straight. You tie the belt. You pull the fabric up until it hits the knee. You check your reflection in a polished bronze mirror. You are a rectangle of wool, divided by vertical lines of sea snail purple, bound by leather. You are contained. You are ready. The tunic was not just clothing. It was a grid. It placed you in the world. And underneath this tunic, usually nothing. Perhaps a simple loincloth, a subligaculum made of linen knotted at the hips. But often, the tunic was the only layer against the skin. The air circulated freely. The body breathed. As we move forward, we must prepare ourselves for the heavy burden that goes on top of the tunic, the garment that defined Rome, the garment that no slave, no foreigner, and no exile was ever permitted to wear, the master of all drapes, the toga. But before we lift that heavy weight, let us stay here for a moment longer in the simplicity of the tunic, the vertical lines, the off-white wool, the silence of the dye vats, the belt tightening and loosening, the rhythm of the daily dress, the white burden, the architecture of the toga. If the tunic is a second skin, the toga is a house. It is a portable architecture of wool that a Roman citizen must construct around his body every single time he wishes to be seen as a citizen. Let go of the image of the simple rectangle we discussed before. The toga is a different geometric beast entirely. It is immense. To understand the scale of it, imagine taking a piece of fabric that is nearly 6 meters long, that is about 18 feet, and perhaps 2 meters wide at its deepest point. It is not a rectangle. It is a semicircle, or perhaps an elongated oval cut in half. Picture this vast sea of cream-colored wool, laid out flat on the floor of a Roman atrium. It covers the mosaic tiles completely. It looks less like a piece of clothing, and more like a carpet, or a sail for a small ship. It is heavy. Depending on the density of the weave, a toga could weigh anywhere from 10 to 15 pounds. That is a significant weight to carry on one's shoulders for an entire day. Putting on a toga was not a simple act of dressing. It was an operation. It was a ritual that required assistance. No Roman senator, no matter how powerful, could dress himself in a toga alone. It was physically impossible to achieve the correct drape without a second pair of hands. And so, the morning ritual involved a trusted slave, the vestiplicus, a specialist whose sole job was to understand the folds of the master's clothes. Let us visualize the process in slow motion. It is a choreography of wool. The man stands in his tunic. The slave picks up the heavy mass of the toga. He gathers about 1/3 of the fabric and throws it over the man's left shoulder. The end of this fabric hangs down in the front, reaching almost to the feet. This is the anchor. It sits heavy on the clavicle. The rest of the fabric, the remaining 12 feet of wool, is then pulled across the back. It must not be too tight, nor too loose. It travels under the right arm. This is the crucial moment. The right arm remains free. It is the arm of action, the arm that gestures in the Senate, the arm that shakes hands. But the left arm begins to disappear. The fabric is brought around the front of the chest. It is draped diagonally, climbing up like a woolen mountain slope towards the left shoulder again. It is thrown over the left shoulder a second time, covering the first layer. The arm is buried. The left hand is now practically useless, employed only to grasp the folds of the toga to keep them from slipping. You are now wrapped in a cocoon. Think about the heat. Rome in August is a furnace. The sun beats down on the 7 hills. reflecting off the white marble of the temples, and you are wrapped in 6 meters of thick, insulating wool. There is no ventilation. The heat rises inside the garment, trapped against the tunic, trapped against the skin. Sweat begins to trickle down the back, absorbed by the heavy layers. To wear a toga was to endure. It was a display of physical discipline. It said to the world, I am so civilized, so dedicated to the state, that I will willingly suffer this discomfort to show my status. And the movement. You cannot run in a toga. You cannot fight in a toga. You cannot work in a toga. You can barely walk quickly. The sheer bulk of the fabric forces you to slow down. It dictates your posture. You must stand straight, chest out, to support the weight on the left shoulder. If you slouch, the toga slips. If you move too abruptly, the folds unravel, and you are left looking ridiculous, with 18 feet of wool trailing behind you like a broken tail. So, the toga created the Roman walk, a slow, deliberate, majestic pace, a gliding motion. The clothing itself engineered the dignity of the wearer. You had to move with purpose and gravity, simply because the wool would allow nothing else. The color, too, was a maintenance nightmare. The standard toga was the toga virilis, the toga of manhood. It was the color of natural wool, an off-white creamy beige. But for those seeking office, the politicians running for election, the toga had to be brighter. They would rub the wool with white chalk, bleaching it until it dazzled the eye. This was the toga candida, the bright white toga. This is where we get the word candidate. A candidate is literally the one dressed in bright white. Imagine the fear of stains. In a city of dust, mud, smoke from fires and food stalls, wearing a pristine white garment that dragged near the ground was a source of constant, low-level anxiety. A splash of wine, a drop of olive oil, a brush against a dirty wall. The toga was ruined. It would have to be sent to the Falones, the dry cleaners of Rome, to be soaked in urine and sulfur to bleach it white again. The smell of the cleaner's shop was pungent, but the result was a garment that signaled purity. Let us look at the complexity of the folds again. As the toga style evolved over the centuries, it became more elaborate. By the time of the early empire, they created a feature called the sinus. This was a large, baggy pouch of fabric draped in front of the chest, created by looping the wool down low before throwing it over the shoulder. It hung like a hammock. It was practical, in a way. Since the toga had no pockets, and indeed the tunic had no pockets, the sinus became a pocket. A Roman man could carry scrolls, a purse of coins, or a seal ring inside this fold of wool. It was a kangaroo pouch made of drapery. Then there was the umbo, the knob. This was a small clump of fabric pulled out from the tight wrap across the chest. It served as a locking mechanism, a knot of friction that helped hold the layers together. But it also became a fashion statement. Men would spend time arranging their umbo just so, ensuring it looked artfully effortless, even though it took 10 minutes to perfect. Stand there for a moment in your imagination. Feel the weight pressing down on your left trap muscle. Feel the restriction of the left arm. Feel the draft of air near the ankles where the hem sways. Feel the scratch of the wool against the neck. The world is slow. You are a statue in motion. You are a Roman citizen encased in the white burden of your civilization. It is quiet inside the toga. The layers muffle the sound of your own heart. You are ready to step out into the forum, not as a man, but as a symbol. The purple border, the dark wool, and the golden thread. We have spoken of the white toga, the toga virilis, the garment of the ordinary citizen. But if you were to stand in the Roman Forum and watch the crowds drift by like slow-moving clouds, you would see that not every toga was a plain expanse of cream. There were signals woven into the edges, colors that marked the wearer as someone apart, someone protected, or someone in mourning. Let us first look at the toga praetexta. Imagine the vast semicircle of white wool we described before. Now visualize the curved edge, the long, sweeping border that wraps around the garment. On the toga praetexta, this edge is not white. It is bordered by a band of purple. This was a difficult feat of weaving. The purple stripe on the tunic was straight, a simple vertical line. But the purple stripe on the toga had to follow the curve. It required the weaver to calculate the tension of the thread, turning the weave slowly, inch by inch, to create a seamless ribbon of color that would drape perfectly when worn. Who wore this garment? It is a strange pairing. It was worn by the highest magistrates, the consuls, the praetors, the men who held the power of life and death. When a magistrate sat in his curule chair, the purple border draped over his knees, a line of blood-red authority warning others not to touch him. It signified that he was sacred, inviolable. To harm a man wearing the praetexta was an act against the gods themselves. But this powerful garment was also worn by freeborn boys. Picture a Roman child, a boy of perhaps 10 years old. He is not yet a man. He is soft, vulnerable, a future citizen. To protect him from the evil eye, the malus oculus, and from the dangers of the city, he is wrapped in the toga praetexta. The purple border acts as a magical barrier, a fortress of color. Around his neck he wears the bulla. Visualize a small, round locket. It might be made of gold if his family is wealthy, or leather if they are poor. It hangs on a cord, resting against the purple stripe of the toga. Inside this locket are amulets, tiny charms meant to ward off sickness and spirits. The boy rattles faintly as he walks. The wool protects his body. The gold protects his soul. He is a precious object, guarded by the state and his family until he comes of age. There was a specific day for shedding this protection, the Liberalia, a festival in March. Imagine the young man, now around 16. He stands in his home. The heavy purple-bordered toga praetexta is taken off his shoulders for the last time. The bulla is removed from his neck and hung on the household shrine, an offering to the Lars, the household gods. He is then draped in the plain white toga virilis. He is now exposed. He is a citizen. He has no purple border to protect him anymore. He must protect himself. Now, let the scene darken. The bright sun of the festival fades. We turn our attention to the toga pulla. The word pulla refers to a dark color, dark gray, black, or a muddy, sorrowful brown. This was the toga of mourning. It was the toga of the funeral procession. When a prominent Roman died, the family and friends would cast aside their white garments. They would seek out wool that came from black sheep, wool that had never been bleached, wool that held the darkness of the earth. They would wrap themselves in this shadow. Imagine a procession moving down the Appian Way. The air is filled with the sound of flute players and professional wailing women, and there, walking slowly behind the bier, is a mass of dark figures. The toga pulla absorbs the light. It creates a visual void in the landscape. It signals to everyone who sees it, "Do not approach me with trivial matters. I am in the realm of the dead." Sometimes, the toga pulla was used as a political weapon. If a popular figure was exiled, or if the republic was in danger, senators might wear the dark toga as a form of silent protest. They would sit in the Senate House, a sea of black wool, a visual manifestation of their displeasure. It was a change of dress, a mutatio vestis. Without saying a word, the color of the wool screamed that something was wrong with the state. The darkness of the fabric reflected the darkness of the times. Finally, let us look at the rarest toga of all, the toga picta, the painted toga. This garment appears only on the most extraordinary occasions. A general has returned from war. He has conquered a new province. The Senate has granted him a triumph. He will ride a chariot through the streets of Rome, up to the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. He cannot wear white. He is, for this one day, representing the god Jupiter himself. The toga picta is not white. It is entirely purple. The entire vast expanse of wool has been soaked in the expensive murex dye we spoke of earlier. It is a deep, shimmering reddish violet. It is heavy with dye. But it is not just purple. It is embroidered with gold. Orris. Real gold thread, spun from metal, is stitched into the wool. The patterns are of palm leaves, symbols of victory. Imagine the weight. Wool is heavy. Dye adds weight. Gold adds weight. The triumphant general is carrying a physical burden that is almost crushing. He stands in the chariot, the gold thread catching the sunlight, flashing and sparking as he moves. He is a glowing ember. The smell of the purple dye, that faint, oceanic metallic scent, wafts around him. He wears a tunic of purple underneath, also embroidered with gold palms, the tunicata palmata. He is encased in precious metal and sea snail blood. The crowd cheers, but the general stands rigid. He has to. The stiffness of the gold embroidery and the bulk of the fabric make natural movement nearly impossible. He is a living icon, a statue that breathes. He is elevated above the human condition, if only for a few hours, by the sheer opulence of his dress. And behind him in the chariot stands a slave, holding a golden crown over his head, whispering, "Remember, you are only a man." The slave doesn't need to whisper it, really. The heavy, hot, suffocating weight of the toga picta is reminder enough that he is mortal, bound by gravity and the limits of physical endurance. Purple borders for the protected, dark wool for the grieving, solid gold and purple for the victor, white for the citizen. The toga was a chameleon. It changed to match the rhythm of the city. It was a code that every Roman understood at a glance. As the sun sets on our imaginary Rome, we see these colors mixing in the streets. The white, the dark, the purple-edged. A slow-moving river of wool flowing home to rest. The veil and the strap, the stola and palla. The air changes here. It is less heavy with the scent of unwashed wool and the metallic tang of purple dye. Instead, imagine the faint scent of rose oil, or perhaps dried lavender kept in a cedar chest. We are looking at the wardrobe of the Roman matrona, the married woman. Just like the men, her foundation was the tunic. But for a woman, the tunic was longer. It was the tunic intima. It reached the ground. It was the layer of privacy. Over this, a woman might wear a second tunic. But the garment that defined her, the garment that told the world she was a respectable, married woman, was the stola. Visualize the stola. It is essentially a long dress, but its construction is distinct. Unlike the tunic, which hangs from the shoulders by the fabric itself, the stola was often suspended by straps. These straps, called instata, rested on the shoulders. They were thin, functional, and created a sleeveless look. This allowed the sleeves of the tunic underneath to be seen, layers of fabric interacting with one another. The stola was voluminous. It was not a tight garment. It was cut from a large amount of cloth to ensure that the figure was obscured, not revealed. It was a garment of modesty. It was meant to cover the feet completely. A woman's ankles were not for public viewing. To ensure this, the stola often had a wide border sewn onto the hem, adding weight and length, dragging softly across the mosaic floors as she walked. Imagine the sound of that movement. Swish, swish. A gentle, rhythmic sweeping of the floor. It was a sound that announced the presence of the lady of the house before she even entered the room. To give this large amount of fabric some shape, belts were used. But unlike the men who belted their tunics at the waist, the Roman woman tied her stola high, just below the bust. This created a high-waisted silhouette, a column of fabric that fell straight down to the floor. The belt, the cingulum, might be a simple ribbon or a decorated cord hidden amongst the folds. The material of the stola could vary. For the average woman, it was still fine wool, spun thin and smooth. But for the wealthy, for the wife of a senator or a successful merchant, the stola might be made of linen imported from Egypt, crisp, cool, and prone to wrinkling in a way that implied luxury. Or, if the family was truly rich, it might be cotton from India, or the most scandalous fabric of all, silk. Silk, or sericum, was a controversial material. It was so fine, so sheer, that moralists like Seneca complained that a woman wearing silk was practically naked. But let us imagine a respectable, modest stola made of fine, opaque wool. Now, we come to color. While men were trapped in their world of white, off-white, and varying shades of serious purple, women were the flowers of the city. The stola could be dyed in any shade the earth provided. Imagine a deep saffron yellow, the color of the crocus flower. This was a color associated with marriage. Imagine a pale sea green mimicking the waters of the Mediterranean. Imagine a soft blue, the color of a summer sky. Imagine a rusty red derived from madder root. When a crowd of Roman women gathered, it was a mosaic of these earth tones, mustards, olives, rusts, and blues moving together. But the stola was only the middle layer, the final piece of the puzzle. The garment that completed the outfit and the woman was the palla. The palla was to the woman what the toga was to the man, but with far less structural rigidity. It was a large rectangle of fabric, similar to a shawl or a cloak, but much larger. It was a wrap. The art of the palla was in the draping. There were no pins to hold it in place. It relied entirely on friction and the posture of the wearer. A woman would wrap the long rectangle around her body, usually throwing one end over the left shoulder, bringing it around the back, under the right arm, and throwing it over the left shoulder again, mirroring the toga, but more loosely. The left arm was swathed in fabric. The left hand held the excess cloth. It was a garment that required constant attention. If you moved too fast, the palla would slip. So, like the toga, the palla enforced a slow, graceful tempo. You had to glide. You had to be aware of your own borders. The most important function of the palla, however, was the veil. In public, a respectable Roman woman did not walk with her head uncovered. It was considered immodest. She did not wear a separate hat. Instead, she would pull the edge of her palla up over the back of her head. Visualize this gesture. It is a moment of withdrawal. A woman steps out of her door into the bright, noisy street. She reaches up with her right hand, finds the edge of the wool resting on her shoulder, and pulls it up to frame her face. The fabric casts a shadow over her features. She is now contained. She has created a portable wall of privacy that travels with her. She can see out, but the world cannot easily see in. She is shielded. When she speaks, the fabric muffles her voice slightly. When the wind blows, she must hold the veil in place with her hand. This gesture, the hand holding the veil at the chin or the neck, is seen in hundreds of statues. It is the pose of Pudicitia, the goddess of modesty. Imagine the tactile sensation of wearing this, the straps of the stola digging slightly into the shoulders, the lightness of the linen against the legs, the heavy warmth of the woolen palla wrapped around the torso, the feeling of the fabric touching the cheeks as the veil is pulled up. There is a sense of enclosure. You are wrapped in layers of protection. The stola covers the feet. The palla covers the head. You are entirely soft, entirely covered, moving through the hard, stone city of Rome like a secret. The colors of the palla would often contrast with the stola. A woman might wear a pale blue stola with a saffron yellow palla, or a white stola with a deep red palla. The combinations were endless, a visual play of color blocking that brightened the dusty streets. But at night, inside the home, the palla would be set aside. The veil would come down. The hair, which had been elaborately piled up and hidden, would be revealed. The heavy wool would be folded away. The woman would return to the stola and the tunic, lighter, freer. The burden of public modesty lifted until the next morning. Let us watch the fabric settle. The dust motes dancing in the light of the atrium. The silent pile of colorful wool on a chair, waiting for the dawn. The stillness of the wardrobe. The hidden layers and the contact with the earth. We have spent much time admiring the outer shell of the Roman citizen. The heavy togas, the sweeping palace, the dyed stripes of status. But these garments did not float on air. They rested on a foundation of hidden linens and leathers, layers that the public eye rarely saw, but which the wearer felt constantly against their skin. Let us begin with the most intimate layer, the subligaculum. The name itself is a mouthful, a heavy Latin word for something very small. It translates roughly to that which is tied underneath. It was the loincloth, the brief. Imagine a simple piece of linen. Linen made from the flax plant is different from wool. It is cooler to the touch. It is smoother. It does not itch. In a world without elastic, without zippers, without snaps, the subligaculum relied on the oldest technology of all, the knot. It was wrapped around the hips, passed between the legs, and tied securely at the waist. It was the great equalizer. The emperor wore one. The senator wore one. The soldier marching in Britain wore one. The gladiator fighting in the Colosseum wore one. Sometimes it was the only thing he wore. For those engaging in heavy labor or exercise, the subligaculum was the uniform. But under the toga, it was merely the first barrier. It absorbed the sweat. It protected the outer wool from the body's oils. It was washed frequently, beaten against rocks in the river or scrubbed in a basin, drying stiff and white in the sun, ready to be tied again. For the Roman woman, there was another layer, the strophium or mamillar. There were no braziers in ancient Rome, no structures of wire and molded cups. There was only the band. Visualize a long strip of soft leather or fine linen. A woman would wrap this band around her chest, pulling it tight to provide support. It was a binding. It flattened the silhouette slightly, keeping the form contained and modest under the tunics. It was fastened with a simple pin or a knot. It was utilitarian. It was a sensation of constant, gentle pressure around the ribcage, a reminder of the body's containment. These garments, the loincloth and the breastband, were the invisible clothing. They were never spoken of in polite society, never sculpted in marble, yet they were the silent companions of every waking moment. Now, let our gaze drift downward, past the hem of the tunic, past the heavy border of the stola, until we reach the ground. We reach the feet. The Roman contact with the earth was mediated by leather. The Romans were master tanners. They understood how to cure hide, how to make it tough enough to march across a continent, or soft enough to wear inside a bedroom. First, consider the solea, the sandal. This was the footwear of the indoors. It was the shoe of peace, of the home, of the summer. Imagine a simple sole made of thick leather or perhaps cork. It protects the bottom of the foot from the cold mosaic tiles. Holding it to the foot is a series of straps, thongs, that pass between the toes and wrap around the ankle. The solea is open. The air touches the skin. When you walk in them, there is a distinctive sound. Slap, slap, slap. The heel lifts and strikes the sole. It is the sound of leisure. However, there was a strict rule. You never wore soli to a formal dinner, or rather, you wore them to the dinner. But the moment you crossed the threshold into the triclinium, the dining room, you took them off. To dine with shoes on was an insult. A slave would take your sandals and store them away. You would recline on the couch barefoot, your feet washed and perhaps perfumed. The solea waited by the door, a symbol of the world left behind. But to step outside, to step into the street, for that, you needed the calceus. The calceus was a boot. It was a shoe that fully enclosed the foot. It was the partner of the toga. Just as you could not wear a toga without a tunic, you should not, strictly speaking, wear a toga without calce. These were not simple shoes. They were complex pieces of engineering. Soft leather wrapped around the entire foot, covering the toes and the heel. Then, long leather straps, attached to the sole, were wound around the ankle and the lower shin, crisscrossing up the leg. They were tied in intricate knots. The calceus gripped the foot. It was secure. It was designed for the uneven paving stones of the Roman roads, the mud, the filth of the city streets. And like everything in Rome, the shoe told a story of status. If you saw a man walking with a high black leather boot secured with 4 straps, you knew he was a senator. But wait, if he was a patrician, a member of the oldest, most aristocratic families, his shoes were not black. They were red, Mullius calceus, the red shoe. Imagine the vibrancy of that color, a deep maroon red flashing against the white paving stones. It was a signal that said, "My ancestors were kings." On these senatorial shoes, there was often a small ivory ornament shaped like a crescent moon, the lunula. It was stitched onto the ankle, a tiny moon glowing on a red leather sky. It was a subtle detail, perhaps invisible from a distance, but the wearer knew it was there. He felt the moon against his ankle bone. The sensation of wearing the calceus was one of being strapped in. The leather laces could be tight. The shin was bound. The foot was warm, perhaps too warm in the summer, but it provided a solid platform. The sole was often studded with iron hobnails, clavi caligari, that gripped the stone. Click, click, click. That was the sound of the street. Iron hitting stone, the heavy tread of the citizen. Inside the house, the soft slap of the sandal. Outside the house, the hard click of the boot. Feet were rarely perfect in Rome. The leather rubbed, the straps chafed. Dust found its way into everything. At the end of the day, the unlacing of the calce was a moment of supreme relief. The knots were picked apart. The leather was peeled back. The foot, pale and marked with the red impressions of the laces, was finally free to breathe. So we have the body wrapped in linen, the chest bound, the feet strapped into leather cages. The Roman citizen is secure. He is grounded. He is ready to walk the path of history, one heavy hobnailed step at a time. The architecture of the face, razors and curls. We rise from the feet to the head. We leave the leather straps and the woolen folds behind to look at the only part of the Roman citizen that was truly naked to the world, the face. But even here, nature was not allowed to run wild. The hair and the beard were tamed, cut, pulled, and burned into submission. Let us step into the tonstrina, the barber shop. It is early morning. The shop is small, open to the street. There is no glass in the windows, only shutters that have been thrown open to let in the light and the air. A bench runs along the wall, occupied by men waiting their turn. They are gossiping, trading news about the Senate, the races, or the price of olive oil. The barber shop is the news center of Rome. But in the center of the room, there is a stool, a simple wooden stool. A man sits on it. A cloth is draped around his neck. He is about to undergo the daily ordeal of the Roman shave. For centuries, during the Republic and the early Empire, the Roman face was clean-shaven. To be smooth was to be civilized. A beard was seen as something Greek, or worse, something barbarian. A true Roman man, like Scipio Africanus or Julius Caesar, showed his jawline. But achieving this smoothness was a brutal process. Visualize the tool, the novacula. It is a razor made of iron or bronze. It is curved, resembling a half moon. But compared to modern steel, iron dulls quickly. It loses its edge. And here is the crucial detail. There is no soap. There is no lather. There is no shaving cream to soften the bristles or lubricate the skin. There is only water. The barber splashes water onto the man's face. He rubs it in. Then he takes the iron blade and begins to scrape. Scritch, scritch. The sound is harsh. The metal drags against the skin. It is a painful experience. Martial, the Roman poet, once wrote that he avoided the barber because these scars on my chin are not from my wife's fingernails, but from the cursed razor. Cuts were inevitable. A small nick on the chin, a slice on the cheek. To stop the bleeding, the barber would press a spider's web soaked in vinegar and oil onto the wound. It was a stinging, pungent remedy. The man in the chair sits perfectly still. He holds his breath. He trusts the barber with his life, or at least with his jugular. It is a moment of intense vulnerability and discipline. To flinch is to bleed. Because of this pain, Wealthy men, very wealthy men, did not go to the shop. They had a personal slave, a private tonsure, who would shave them slowly, carefully, perhaps using pumice stones to grind the hair away gently, or depilatory creams made of resin, pitch, and bat's blood. But for the average citizen, the morning shave was a gritty, watery, ironclad ritual of endurance. Later in history, the Emperor Hadrian would change everything. He wore a beard. Some say it was to hide scars on his face. Others say it was his love for Greek philosophy. But suddenly, the razor was put down. The beard returned. The chin was hidden again. Fashion shifted, and the collective sigh of relief from Roman men must have been audible. Now, let us leave the masculine world of the razor and enter the domus, the private quarters of the women. Here, the torture is not of the skin, but of the hair itself. Meet the ornatrix. She is a slave, highly skilled, highly valued, and often highly stressed. Her job is to construct the mistress's hair, and construct is the correct word. Roman women's hairstyles were not casual. They were architectural feats. We are talking about the Flavian hairstyles, famous for their height and complexity. Imagine a honeycomb of curls. Row upon row of tight, perfect ringlets piled high above the forehead, creating a diadem of hair. This was not natural. No hair grows like that. To achieve this, the ornatrix used the calamistrum. Visualize a metal rod, a hollow tube of iron. This was the curling iron of the ancient world, but there was no electricity. To heat it, the slave had to place the iron rod into a brazier of hot ashes. She had to watch it carefully. If it was too cool, it would not curl the hair. If it was too hot, it would singe the hair, burning it right off the head. The smell of burnt hair was a common scent in the morning boudoir. The mistress sits in a high-backed chair, holding a polished bronze mirror. The ornatrix works quickly. She wraps a lock of hair around the hot iron. She waits. She releases it. A perfect steaming curl falls into place. She repeats this 20, 30, 50 times. But the natural hair was often not enough. It was too thin or too short to create the towering styles required by fashion. So they cheated. They used false hair, dead hair, hair harvested from the heads of captured barbarians. Blonde hair from the Germanic tribes and red hair from the Celts were particularly prized. This hair was turned into wigs, gallerus, or into hair pieces and extensions. The ornatrix would sew these pieces into the mistress's natural hair. She would use wool padding to create volume, like a hidden cushion, and then comb the hair over it to hide the mechanics. She would use bone pins, ivory bodkins, and nets made of gold thread to hold the structure together. It was heavy. A Roman woman walked around with a kilogram of wool, metal, and other people's hair balanced on her head. It required a stiff neck. It required balance. You could not move your head quickly, or the tower might shift. And the time. This process could take hours. The morning toilette was a marathon. The poet Ovid warned men not to surprise their wives in the morning, lest they see the construction site before the building was finished. The wigs on the table, the jars of bear grease used for shine, the powders made of soot used to darken the eyebrows. But when it was done, when the last pin was inserted, the result was a statue. A woman with a halo of curls, a face framed by artifice, a man with a jaw scraped clean by iron. They were polished. They were prepared. The chaotic, organic nature of the human body, the growing stubble, the messy hair, had been conquered by Roman discipline. They were ready to be seen. The sound of gold and the weight of scent We have dressed the body in wool and linen. We have strapped the feet in leather. We have sculpted the hair with iron and heat. Now we must adorn the finished form. We must add the details that catch the light and the ear. In the quiet corridors of a Roman villa, you would hear a woman coming before you saw her. It was a specific sound, a rhythmic clicking that accompanied every step. This was the sound of crotalia. Crotalia translates to rattles or clappers. It was the popular name for a specific type of earring adored by Roman women. Imagine a gold bar suspended from the earlobe. Hanging from this bar are 2 or 3 smaller pendants, each ending in a large, lustrous pearl. When the woman moved, when she turned her head to look at a servant or walked across the atrium, the pearls would swing. They would strike against each other. Click, click, click. It was a soft, dry sound. To the Roman ear, this was the sound of extreme wealth. Pearls were astronomically expensive, imported from the Persian Gulf. To wear them was to wear a fortune. To let them crash into each other, risking damage, was the ultimate display of nonchalance. "I am so rich," the sound said, "that I can let my jewels rattle like a baby's toy." The weight of the jewelry was significant. Roman gold was high carat, soft and yellow. Necklaces were heavy chains, often shaped like snakes coiling around the throat. Bracelets wound around the wrists and upper arms, sometimes in the shape of spiraling serpents with eyes made of emeralds or rubies. The metal warmed against the skin. It absorbed the body heat. It was a heavy, golden embrace. For the men, the adornment was more functional, but no less heavy. The primary piece of male jewelry was the annulus, the ring. In the early days of the Republic, a Roman citizen wore a ring of iron, just iron. It was a symbol of strength, of austerity. It was not for decoration, it was a tool. The face of the ring was a seal. It bore the family crest, or a portrait of an ancestor, or a symbol of the man's identity, a lion, a ship, a god. Visualize the moment of its use. A document is written, a contract is made. Melted wax, red or black, is dripped onto the papyrus. The hot wax pools, smelling of beeswax and resin. The man raises his hand. The heavy iron ring is pressed down into the soft, hot puddle. He holds it there. The wax cools. The ring is lifted. The impression is left behind. As the empire grew richer, the iron turned to gold. The equites, the knightly class, claimed the right to wear gold rings. Soon, senators wore them. Men began to wear rings on every joint of every finger. They had summer rings, lighter, and winter rings, heavier. But the motion remained the same. The press, the hold, the seal. Holding the heavy clothing together was another piece of metal, the fibula. The toga, as we discussed, was held by friction. But the cloak, the lacerna, or the paludamentum of a soldier, needed a pin. The fibula was the safety pin of the ancient world. But it was not a flimsy piece of wire. It was a solid bronze or gold brooch. Imagine the needle of the fibula. It is thick. It has to pierce through layers of boiled wool. You have to push it with force. Push. It slides through the dense fabric. You clasp it shut. It sits on the shoulder, a metallic anchor in a sea of cloth. If it is a soldier's fibula, it is simple, perhaps shaped like a crossbow. If it is an emperor's, it is studded with gems, a star resting on the shoulder. Finally, we come to the invisible accessory, the scent. The Roman world did not use alcohol-based perfumes like we do. Their scents were not airy sprays that evaporated in seconds. They were unguenta, ointments, oils. The base was olive oil, thick and green gold. To this, they added the heavy scents of the East, Rhodesian iris, saffron from Cilicia, cinnamon and myrrh from Arabia, frankincense. These mixtures were thick. They were sticky. To apply perfume was to grease the skin. Imagine the process after a bath. The skin is clean, scraped raw by the strigil, a curved metal tool used to remove dirt and oil. Now, fresh oil is poured into the palm of the hand. It is rubbed onto the arms, the chest, the neck. The skin glistens. It shines. You are literally anointed. The scent is heavy. It hangs in the air. It does not smell sharp or chemical. It smells earthy, floral, and resinous. It smells like a temple. As the day heats up, the oil warms on the skin, releasing the fragrance slowly, hour after hour. A Roman crowd would smell of sweat, yes, and wool, but also of this overwhelming, cloying sweetness of rose oil and myrrh. It was a scent that clung to the furniture, to the curtains, to the very walls of the house. So, our Roman figure stands before us fully realized. We hear the click-click of the pearl earrings. We see the flash of the heavy gold seal ring. We see the bronze fibula pinning the heavy cloak. And we smell the deep, resinous aroma of scented oils radiating from their shining skin. They are a feast for the senses. They are a walking display of the empire's trade routes, pearls from the east, gold from Spain, amber from the north, incense from the south, all worn on a single body, the dinner suit and the napkin sack. We enter the triclinium, the dining room. The light here is different. It is flickering. Dozens of oil lamps, shaped like birds or feet or ships, are placed on stands, casting long, dancing shadows against the frescoed walls. The air is warm and smells of roasted meat and heated wine. Imagine trying to dine in a toga. We established earlier that the toga restricts the left arm. It wraps around the torso in a tight cocoon. Now, consider the Roman dining posture. Romans did not sit upright at tables like we do. They reclined. They lay on their sides on large cushioned couches called lecti. Specifically, they lay on their left sides, leaning on their left elbows. The right hand was left free to reach for food. If you were wearing a toga, your left arm, the supporting arm, would be strangled by 6 meters of thick wool. The fabric would bunch up under your armpit. It would drag in the sauce. It would be hot, itchy, and impossibly uncomfortable. To dine in a toga was a torture reserved only for formal state banquets, where protocol outweighed digestion. For a relaxed dinner among friends, the toga had to go. In its place came the synthesis. The synthesis was the dinner suit of ancient Rome. It is a fascinating garment because it was a hybrid, a mix of two things, hence the name synthesis. It combined the simplicity of the tunic with the looseness of the toga, but without the bulk. Imagine a garment made not of heavy sheep's wool, but of fine, light muslin or silk. It was cut loosely. It draped easily over the body. It did not require a belt. It was designed for one thing only, reclining. It was designed to bunch up softly under the elbow without cutting off circulation. It was designed to let the stomach expand. And the colors, while the toga was white and the tunic was usually off-white or striped, the synthesis was an explosion of color. This was the time for a Roman man to express himself. At a dinner party, you might see a man wearing a synthesis of bright emerald green. Another might wear deep sky blue. Another, a shocking shade of pink or violet. The poet Martial tells us of a wealthy host named Zoilus who would change his synthesis 11 times during a single dinner. With every course, he would leave the room and return in a new color. First, a red suit for the appetizers, then a blue one for the fish, then a green one for the roast boar. The swish of his changing fabrics was the soundtrack of the meal. It was a garment of leisure. You could not wear it on the street. To be seen in public in a synthesis was a scandal. It was like walking down the street in your pajamas. It was strictly for the private world of the lamp-lit room. Now, let us look at the hands. The Romans ate with their fingers. There were spoons for soups and sauces, yes, but for meat, bread, and vegetables, the hand was the tool. The food was cut into bite-sized pieces by slaves before it was served. The diner would reach out with the right hand, pick up a piece of pork glazed with honey, and place it in his mouth. This meant the fingers got greasy, sticky. There were slaves with jugs of water and bowls who would come around to wash the guests' hands between courses. But for the immediate need, there was the mappa. The mappa is the ancestor of our napkin, but in Rome it was larger, coarser, and far more important. It was a large square of linen. It was not provided by the host. You brought your own. Imagine the guest arriving at the house. He is wearing his synthesis. Under his arm, or tucked into a fold of his clothes, is his mappa. It is white, perhaps with a colored border, or his name embroidered in the corner. When he climbs onto the dining couch, he unfolds the linen. He spreads it out. It protects the expensive purple coverlet of the couch from spills. It is his personal territory. Throughout the meal, he wipes his fingers on it. The linen absorbs the olive oil, the wine drips, the sauce. It becomes stained with the history of the dinner. But the mappa had a second, secret function. It was a doggy bag. Roman hospitality had a custom called apophoraeta, gifts to take away. But even beyond formal gifts, it was socially acceptable, even expected, for a guest to take home leftovers. Imagine the dinner is winding down. There are figs left on the silver platter. There is a small loaf of bread. There is a pomegranate. The guest does not ask for a box. He takes his mappa, now slightly stained, and he begins to pile the food into the center. He wraps the linen corners together. He ties a knot. He has created a small sack of food. When he leaves the party, he carries his mappa like a bundle. The linen is heavy with the spoils of the feast. He hands it to his slave to carry home, or carries it himself if he is humble. So, the mappa was a tool of hygiene and a tool of transport. It was a sturdy, working piece of cloth. Let us settle back into the atmosphere of the room. The meal lasts for hours. The synthesis feels light and airy against the skin. The belt is non-existent. The body is relaxed. The sandals, as we mentioned, are by the door. The feet are bare, perhaps resting on the soft cushion of the couch. The heavy wool of the day is forgotten. The stiff leather shoes are forgotten. There is only the softness of the silk, the texture of the linen napkin, the taste of the wine, and the low murmur of conversation. Sometimes, if the room was hot, a slave with a large fan made of peacock feathers would stand behind the couch. Swish, swish. The air moves. The feathers shimmer in the lamplight. The cool breeze touches the neck. The synthesis flutters slightly. This is the Roman evening. It is a time of unbinding. The strict codes of the citizen are loosened, layer by layer, until only the man and his comfort remain. As the lamps burn low and the oil runs out, the guests begin to wrap their mappas, tighten the knots, and prepare to step back out into the cool night air. But for now, we stay on the couch, surrounded by soft fabrics and the smell of extinguishing wicks. The iron collar and the bronze mask, slaves and gladiators. In the Roman world, clothing was usually a sign of who you were, but for a vast portion of the population, clothing was a sign of who they belonged to. Let us first look at the servus, the slave. There was no single uniform for a slave. A high-ranking slave in the emperor's household might wear a tunic of fine white wool, indistinguishable from a free citizen, except for the lack of a toga. But for the field slave, the porter, the laborer, the clothing was purely functional. It was rough. The wool was called pilus. It was dark, oily, and unprocessed. It was the color of dirt, browns, grays, muddy russets. It was durable. It was meant to withstand friction, sweat, and rain without tearing. The most common garment was the exomis. Visualize a simple tunic, but instead of 2 shoulder straps or sleeves, it has only one. It is fastened over the left shoulder, leaving the right shoulder and the entire right arm and chest bare. This was the garment of hard labor. It allowed maximum freedom of movement for the right arm, the arm that held the hammer, the sickle, the heavy amphora. The knot on the left shoulder was tight, the fabric draped diagonally across the chest. The skin of the exposed shoulder would be tanned dark by the sun, toughened by the elements. There was no modesty here. The body was a tool, and the exomis was the casing for that tool. On their feet, they often wore wooden clogs or simple rawhide wrappings. Heavy, clunky, utilitarian. The sound of a slave walking was different from the click of a citizen's boot. It was a dull thud. But there was one accessory that marked the slave most cruelly: the collar. Not all slaves wore them, but many did. It was a metal band, usually iron or bronze. It was soldered shut around the neck. It could not be removed. Attached to the collar was a bronze tag, a bulla of sorts. On it, an inscription was engraved: Tenemene fugia. Hold me lest I flee. Return me to my master Zoninus at the shop near the Temple of Flora, and you will receive a solidus. Imagine the weight of that iron on the collar bone. Cold in the winter, hot in the summer. A constant, chafing reminder of ownership. It was a necklace of captivity. Now, let us turn our eyes to the arena, to the gladiator. The gladiator occupied a strange space. He was a superstar, worshipped by the crowds, yet he was infamia, socially dead, an outcast, lower than a beggar. His clothing reflected this paradox. It was a mix of nakedness and heavy ornate armor. The base layer was the subligaculum, the loincloth we spoke of before. But for the gladiator, it was often colored, bright red, blue, or white, and held in place by the balteus. The balteus was a magnificent belt. It was wide, made of thick, stiff leather. It protected the lower abdomen and the kidneys. It was often decorated with gold or silver studs, or embossed with images of eagles and wolves. It was cinched tight, forcing the gladiator to stand tall. But the most distinctive piece of clothing was the manica. Look at the gladiator's arm. Usually the right arm, the sword arm. It is wrapped. The manica was a segmented arm guard. It could be made of padded linen, quilted, and thick, providing a soft cushion against blows. Or it could be made of leather strips, overlapping like the scales of a reptile. Or, in its most expensive form, it was made of metal plates. Imagine the sensation of the manica. You pull it on like a long sleeve. It is tight. It compresses the muscles. It restricts the blood flow slightly. As you bend your arm, the segments slide over each other. Creak, slide, creak. It turns the human arm into a mechanical limb, an armored claw holding the sword. On the legs, they wore ochre, greaves. These were metal shin guards, usually made of bronze. They started at the ankle and reached up to the knee. They were lined with felt or sponge to prevent the metal from rubbing the bone raw. They were strapped on tightly with leather laces behind the calf. When a gladiator walked, the greaves might clang against each other. Clang, clang. A metallic, bell-like sound. And finally, the helmet, the galea. This is the item that removes the humanity completely. The Roman gladiator helmet was heavy. It could weigh 7 or 8 pounds. It covered the entire head, the neck, and the face. There was no open face. There was a grill, a mesh of bronze wire or a metal plate with small pierced eye holes covered the face. Imagine putting it on. The world goes dark. Your peripheral vision is gone. You can only see what is directly in front of you through the small holes. The sound changes. The roar of the crowd becomes muffled, distant, like the sound of the ocean. But the sound of your own body becomes amplified. You hear your own breathing, loud and ragged, echoing inside the bronze dome. Ha! Ha! You hear your own heart beating in your ears. The air inside the helmet quickly becomes hot. It becomes humid with your breath. The smell is of old sweat, oiled metal, and the leather lining. You are no longer a man with a face. You are a mask. You are a symbol, a secutor, a thrax, a myrmeo. The helmet turns you into a monster, a faceless force of violence. The contrast is striking. The bare chest, exposed and vulnerable, shining with oil and sweat. The heavy articulated armor on the limbs. The anonymous metal face. The gladiator is a collage of textures: skin, leather, linen, bronze. They wait in the tunnels beneath the amphitheater. The air is cool and damp. They adjust their belts. They tighten the straps of their greaves. They test the weight of the manica. They are dressed to die or to kill. And high above them, in the stands, the senators in their purple-striped tunics and the women in their saffron pallas. Wait for the show. Their soft wool garments a world away from the hard iron and exposed flesh of the arena floor. The iron shell and the rhythm of the march. A Roman legionary does not just get dressed, he assembles himself. He builds a fortress around his body, piece by piece. It begins, as always, with the tunic. But the military tunic is different. It is shorter, stopping well above the knee to allow for running and marching. It is often red, a dull brick red dyed with madder root, meant to hide dirt, and perhaps, as legend says, to hide blood. But often, it is just the natural off-white of wool. It is thick. It provides the padding for what comes next. Before the armor is put on, there is a small, crucial piece of cloth that saves the soldier from agony. The focul. The focul is a scarf, a simple strip of wool or linen wrapped around the neck. It is not for warmth, though it helps. It is for friction. Without the focul, the metal collar of the armor would chew into the neck, rubbing the skin raw within an hour of marching. The soldier wraps this soft cloth tight, tucking the ends in. It is the buffer between the flesh and the machine. Now comes the lorica segmentata, the segmented armor. This is a marvel of engineering. It is not a solid breastplate like the Greeks wore. It is flexible. It is made of horizontal hoops of iron, fastened together on the inside with leather straps. Imagine a lobster's tail. The plates slide over one another. To put it on is a two-man job. The soldier stands with his arms out. His comrade places the two halves of the armor around him. Clack, clack. The iron plates meet in the front and back. Now, the tying begins. There are brass hooks and leather laces. The laces must be tightened. The armor cinches in. It hugs the torso. It is heavy, about 9 kilograms, 20 pounds. But the weight is distributed. It sits on the shoulders. It hugs the ribs. When the soldier breathes, the armor expands. When he bends, the plates telescope, sliding up and down. Screech, slide. It is a noisy garment. It is a cage of iron that moves with the lungs. It smells of the olive oil used to keep the metal from rusting. Around the waist goes the cingulum militare, the military belt. This is the badge of the soldier. Even when he is not wearing his armor, he wears his belt. It is heavy leather, covered in plates of bronze or tin. Hanging down from the front of the belt is the apron, 4 or 5 strips of leather that hang over the groin. These strips are weighed down with metal pendants. Why are they there? They offer little protection. They are there for the sound. When a legionary walks, these metal-studded strips swing and strike against each other. Jingle, jangle, clink. Now multiply that sound by 5,000 men. The approach of a Roman legion was announced by a high-pitched, rhythmic, metallic, shimmering sound. It was a psychological weapon. The enemy heard the machine coming before they saw it. Finally, we look at the feet, the caligae. These are the marching boots that conquered the world. They are not like modern boots. They are open. They look like a complex network of leather straps, a latticework cage for the foot. This design is genius. If a soldier marched 20 miles a day in a closed boot, his feet would rot from the sweat. The caligae allow the air to circulate. The feet stay dry. If he steps in a river, the water drains out immediately. But the secret is on the bottom. Turn the boot over. The sole is thick, made of multiple layers of cowhide. Driven into this sole are hobnails, iron studs, clavey. There are perhaps 80 or 90 nails in each boot, arranged in a pattern designed to grip the earth. Imagine the sound of the march. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Iron biting into dirt, iron striking stone. The shock of the step travels up the leg, through the shin bones, past the knees. The soldier learns to walk with a specific gait to minimize the jar. It is a rolling walk. The caligae are tied with a single long lace that winds up the ankle. The leather is oiled to keep it soft, but inevitably, it rubs. Every soldier carries a supply of tallow or fat to grease the spots where the leather bites the skin. So there he stands, the legionary. His neck is wrapped in the focal. His torso is encased in the sliding plates of the lorica. His waist is chiming with the cingulum. His feet are shod in iron-studded caligae. He carries a curved shield, the scutum, which has a horizontal grip that forces him to keep his arms straight. He carries a javelin, the pilum, which is weighted with lead. He is a walking arsenal. He is heavy. The total weight of his kit is over 40 kilograms, but he does not slouch. The armor holds him up. The belt pulls him in. The boots grip the road. He is no longer an individual. He is a brick in the wall of Rome. The order is given. Dextro pede, right foot. The column moves. The sound begins. The rhythmic grinding of iron on stone, the jingling of the belts, the creaking of the leather straps inside the armor. It is a hypnotic, repetitive, industrial noise that echoes across the valleys of Europe. They walk for hours. The rhythm never changes. The friction never stops. The weight never lifts. This is the dress code of endurance. The wall of wool, cloaks, and the cold. We have spoken of tunics and togas, garments of the city and the sun, but the Roman Empire stretched far beyond the warm olive groves of Italy. It reached into the gray, damp forests of Germany and the windswept moors of northern England. Here, the thin tunic was not enough. Here, clothing had to be a shelter. Let us look at the sagum. This was the garment of war. In fact, the phrase sumere sagum, to put on the sagum, was a metaphor for declaring war. Visually, it is deceptively simple. It is a rectangle of heavy, coarse wool. It is usually dyed a deep red or a rusty brown. But do not let the simplicity fool you. This was high-technology survival gear. The wool for a sagum was not washed clean. It was left greasy. The natural lanolin of the sheep was preserved in the fiber. Why? Because lanolin is waterproof. When the rain falls on a sagum, it beads up. It rolls off. The soldier stands inside a tent of his own making. He wraps the rectangle around his shoulders. He pins it on the right shoulder with a heavy bronze fibula. This leaves his right arm free to hold a spear, while the left side of his body is double wrapped in warmth. At night, on the hard ground of a camp, the sagum becomes his blanket. He unpins it, spreads it out, and curls up underneath it. It smells of wet dog, of smoke, and of the soldier's own sweat. It is his home. But for the traveler, for the merchant crossing the Alps, or the civilian walking in the rain, there was the pennula. The pennula is the ancestor of the modern poncho. Unlike the sagum, which was an open rectangle, the pennula was sewn. It was tailored. Imagine a large circle or semicircle of heavy felted wool. A hole is cut in the center for the head. The front is sewn shut. To put it on, you have to dive into it. You pull it over your head, and it falls around you like a cone. It restricted the arms. To do anything, you had to lift the heavy hem of the cloak. But this restriction was the point. It sealed the heat in. It created a chimney of warmth around the body. And it had a crucial feature, the cucullus, the hood. The hood was often sewn directly onto the neck of the pennula. When the freezing rain of a British winter began to fall, the traveler would pull the pointed hood up. The world narrows. The wind is blocked. The rain taps against the felted wool. Tap, tap, tap. But it does not touch the skin. Some pennulae were made of leather. These were heavy, stiff garments. Imagine wearing a leather tent. The leather would creak with every step. It was completely windproof. But most preferred the wool, which could breathe, which could stay warm even when wet. Now, look at the extremities. The Romans are often depicted in movies with bare legs, freezing in the snow. This is false. They liked to be warm. They wore fascia. These were long strips of cloth, like bandages. A soldier or a farmer would wrap these strips spirally around his legs, from the ankle up to the knee, covering the gap between the boot and the tunic. It was a makeshift gaiter. It supported the calf muscle and trapped a layer of warm air against the skin. And yes, they wore socks. Udons. These were not knitted in the way we knit socks today. They were made using a technique called null binding, a single needle method that creates a dense, indestructible fabric that does not unravel. Or they were sewn from felt. Imagine pulling on a pair of thick, scratchy wool socks. They are not elastic. They are loose. You stuff your foot, encased in this wool, into the leather boot. The fit is snug. The toes are protected from the frostbite that claimed so many fingers and toes in the ancient world. In the deepest winter, a man might wear a subucula, an undertunic, then a tunic, then a stuffed tunic, padded with wool batting, and then the heavy penula on top. He is a sphere of wool. He walks slowly. The weight of the wet wool drags on his shoulders. The cloak becomes heavier as it absorbs the moisture of the fog. But inside he is dry. The smell of damp wool is everywhere, that musky organic barnyard scent. But it is the scent of survival. He pulls his hood down further. He tucks his hands inside the cloak. He is a self-contained unit of heat moving through a frozen landscape. The bright purples and golds of Rome seem very far away now. Here, everything is gray, brown, and off-white, the colors of the earth and the sheep. The wind howls against the penula, but the felt holds. The Roman marches on, the smell of ammonia and the dance of the fullers. If you were walking through the narrow streets of Rome, you would smell a fullonica, a fullery, long before you saw it. It was a sharp, stinging scent that caught in the back of your throat. It was the smell of stale urine. To us, this sounds repulsive. To a Roman, it smelled like business. It smelled like whiteness. You see, the Romans knew that ammonia was a powerful cleaning agent. It cuts through grease. It bleaches fabric. And the most readily available source of ammonia was human urine. Large clay jars were placed on street corners for passers-by to relieve themselves in. This liquid was collected, taxed, the famous vectigal urinae, introduced by Emperor Vespasian, and sold to the laundry businesses. Let us step inside the Fullonica. It is a large, open courtyard. The ground is wet and slippery. There are rows of small tubs or stalls, waist deep, separated by low walls. Inside these tubs are the clothes of Rome, the dirty togas of senators, the stained tunics of merchants, the dusty cloaks of travelers. They are soaking in a mixture of water, alkaline chemicals, and the prized aged urine. But the machines that agitate these clothes are human beings. The workers, known as fullones, stand in the tubs. They are barefoot. Their tunics are tucked up high. They hold onto the sides of the walls for balance, and they dance. It is a rhythmic, exhausting stomp. This is the Saltus Fullonicus. The fullers jump. Splash, stomp, splash, stomp. They lift their legs high and drive their heels down into the sodden mass of wool. They are the agitators. For hours they tread on the cloth, forcing the cleaning fluid through the dense fibers, crushing the dirt out, breaking down the grease spots from the previous night's dinner. The sound is continuous. The splashing of water, the grunts of the men, the squelch of wet wool. It is heavy labor. The ammonia fumes rise from the tubs, stinging the eyes. The skin on the workers' legs is bleached white and often covered in ulcers from the harsh chemicals. It is a job for the lowest of the low, often slaves or very poor freedmen. Once the stomping is done, the clothes are hauled out. They are heavy with water. They must be rinsed. They are taken to large rinsing tanks where clean water flows. The dirty brown liquid is washed away. But the process is not over. The wool must be whitened. The wet togas are draped over wicker frames shaped like beehives or bells. Underneath these frames, small pots of sulfur are lit. Sulfur, the yellow brimstone. As it burns, it releases sulfur dioxide gas. The gas rises, trapped by the wicker frame, and permeates the wet wool. It is a chemical bleaching process. The fumes are choking, smelling of rotten eggs, but they turn the yellowing wool a brilliant, blinding white. Finally, the finishing touches. The dried cloth is rough. It has been abused. It needs to be softened. The Phallones rub the fabric with Creta Phallonia, fuller's earth, a type of absorbent clay. This soaks up any remaining grease. Then they raise the nap of the wool. They use the dried skin of a hedgehog or specialized combs made of thistles. Scritch, scratch. They brush the wool vigorously. This pulls up the fibers, making the toga look fluffy and new again. It hides the wear and tear. Then, the press. The clothes are folded carefully and placed between heavy wooden boards. Giant screws are turned. The pressure creates sharp, crisp creases in the fabric. A properly pressed toga has a geometric perfection to it. When a Roman senator sends his slave to pick up his toga, it comes back transformed. It is stiff. It is blindingly white. It smells faintly of sulfur and clay, a clean smell to the Roman nose. The stains of the wine, the mud of the street, the sweat of the body, all have been stomped away by the feet of the Phallones. There is a famous story of Emperor Vespasian's son, Titus, complaining about the tax on urine. He found it disgusting that the state should profit from such a thing. Vespasian picked up a gold coin, a coin that had entered the treasury from this very tax. He held it under his son's nose. "Does it smell?" he asked. "No," Titus replied. "Pecunia non olet," said the emperor. "Money does not stink." But the Phallonica stank. It was the foul-smelling engine room that kept the visual splendor of Rome alive. Without these barefoot men stomping in vats of ammonia, the men in white togas would have been a dingy, gray, greasy mob. The brightness of the empire was built on the most basic of human waste. Let us watch the steam rise from the drying racks. Let us hear the rhythmic splashing of the feet. The cycle continues, dirt in, white out. The transparent silk and the forbidden trousers. For hundreds of years, Rome was a world of wool and linen. These were honest fabrics. They were heavy. They hid the body. But then came the caravans. From the mysterious lands of the Seres, the silk people of China, came a fabric that defied Roman logic. It was called sericum, silk. The Romans did not know how it was made. Pliny the Elder, the great naturalist, confidently wrote that silk was harvested from the downy leaves of trees, combed off like cotton. They could not imagine the worm, the cocoon, or the mulberry leaf. They only knew the result. And the result was water woven into thread. Imagine the shock of seeing silk for the first time in a room full of heavy wool togas. It shimmered. It caught the light like oil. It was incredibly light, almost weightless. But most shockingly, it was transparent. A woman wearing a tunic of pure, thin silk was, for all intents and purposes, nude. The fabric clung to every curve. The light passed right through it. The moralists of Rome were horrified. Seneca thundered against it. "I see garments of silk, if materials that do not hide the body, nor even one's decency can be called garments. Wretched flocks of maids labor, so that the adulteress may be visible through her thin dress, so that her husband has no more acquaintance than any outsider or foreigner with his wife's body." Yet the desire was unstoppable. Silk was worth its weight in gold. Literally, a pound of purple-dyed silk cost a fortune that could buy a small estate. It became the ultimate status symbol. It started with the women, but soon the men followed. The Emperor Elagabalus, known for his excesses, was said to be the first Roman man to wear clothes entirely of silk. He refused to touch wool. He wanted only the smooth, cool caress of the East against his skin. The rugged, scratchy austerity of the Republic was dissolving into a shimmering, translucent luxury. But while the East brought softness, the North brought something else. Something the Romans found even more disturbing, not because it was luxurious, but because it was barbarian. It was the bracci, the trousers. To a traditional Roman, trousers were the sign of the savage. The Persians wore them. The Gauls wore them. The Germans wore them. They were bags for the legs. Cicero used the term trousered nations as an insult, a way to describe the uncivilized world. A real man's legs were meant to be free, covered only by the drape of the tunic. To encase each leg individually was seen as effeminate, restrictive, and ugly. But the climate does not care about culture. As Roman soldiers spent more time on the freezing borders of the Rhine and the Danube, as we discussed in the section on the Sogum, they began to realize that the barbarians had a point. Bare legs in the snow were a liability. Slowly, tentatively, the legions began to adopt the bracci. At first, they were short. Feminalia. They stopped at the knee, hidden under the tunic, a secret concession to the cold. Then they grew longer. They reached the ankle. They became tighter. By the 3rd and 4th centuries A.D., the unthinkable had happened. The emperor himself was wearing trousers. They were often made of leather or wool, sometimes decorated with patterns. The loose, flowing silhouette of the classical world was being replaced by the fitted, limb-encasing silhouette of the medieval world to come. Along with trousers came a new kind of tunic, the dalmatic. The old T-shaped tunic was sleeveless or had very short sleeves. The dalmatic had long, wide sleeves that reached the wrists. Again, this was originally seen as scandalous. To cover the arms was a sign of weakness. But the dalmatic was comfortable. It was easy to put on. It did not require complex belting. It was often heavily decorated. Unlike the simple stripes of the old days, the dalmatic was covered in orbiculi, round patches of intricate embroidery, and decorated hems. The visual language was changing. The old Roman look was about drape. It was about how gravity pulled a large piece of plain white cloth around a body. It was three-dimensional sculpture. The new look was about surface. It was about flat garments, fitted to the body, covered in complex two-dimensional patterns, jewels, and embroidery. Rome was becoming Byzantine. The statue-like stillness was being replaced by a stiff, glittering opulence. The toga, that heavy white burden we carried for so long, began to die. It was simply too hard to wear. It was too expensive to clean. It was too clumsy for a world that was becoming more dangerous, more militarized. It shrank. It became a narrow, folded band of stiff fabric, draped across the chest merely as a ritual symbol, like a sash. It was no longer a garment. It was a costume. The pallium, a simpler cloak, took its place. So we see the transition from the rough, lanolin-smelling wool of the shepherd to the blinding white, sulfur-bleached toga of the senator, to the translucent, golden silk of the decadent court, and finally, to the practical, fitted trousers and long sleeves of the soldier emperor. The body was being enclosed. The skin was disappearing. The looseness of the ancient Mediterranean was tightening into the armored, buttoned-up protection of the Middle Ages. As the sun sets on the empire, the silhouettes change. The white ghosts of the Forum are replaced by figures in multicolored silks and leather leggings, moving briskly, no longer held back by the weight of the toga. The coin, the ash, and the eternal rest. The noise of the city has faded completely now. The stomping of the fullers, the clanging of the gladiator's armor, the shouting of the political candidates, it is all gone. We are back in the atrium of the family home. But the mood is different. The heavy cypress branches have been placed outside the door. A silent signal to the neighborhood that the household is in mourning. It is time to dress the body for its final rest. In Rome, death was not the end of the dress code. It was the moment when the rules were applied with the most absolute rigidity. A man might have been lazy with his toga in life, preferring the loose comfort of the synthesis or the tunic, but in death, he had to be a citizen. He had to meet his ancestors in full uniform. First, the preparation. The body is not left alone. It is washed. Warm water is brought in bronze basins. Sponges, soft and porous, are dipped into the water. The skin is cleansed of the sweat and dust of the final illness. It is a gentle, rhythmic washing. Then comes the oil. We spoke of the heavy perfumes of the living. For the dead, the anointing is even more generous. Cedar oil, myrrh, and frankincense are rubbed into the limbs. The body glistens. It smells of the resinous sap of trees, a preservation of the earth. Now, the dressing begins. The tunic is put on. It is clean, white, perhaps new. Then, the toga. The family members struggle with the heavy wool one last time. They lift the stiff left arm. They drape the fabric. They arrange the sinus and the umbo. They create the perfect folds that the man could rarely maintain in life. If he was a censor or a consul, he is dressed in the toga praetexta, the purple border arranged carefully to show his rank. Even in the silence of the tomb, the hierarchy must be visible. A wreath is placed on his head, not a heavy gold crown, but a wreath of flowers and leaves, rosemary, violets, or laurel. The fragility of the petals contrasts with the heavy permanence of the wool. And there is one final accessory, the Charon's obol, a coin. A single bronze or silver coin is placed in the mouth, resting on the tongue, or sometimes placed over the eyes. It is the toll fee for the ferryman of the underworld. It is the taste of metal for eternity. The body is laid out on the lectus funebris, the funeral couch. It stands in the atrium, feet pointing towards the door, ready to leave. The lamps burn low. The shadows of the toga folds are long and deep. The procession begins. The body is carried out, and here we see the final destiny of all these fabrics we have discussed. For centuries, the Roman way was cremation. The great funeral pyre, the rogus, is built of wood, pine, and cypress. The body, wrapped in its finest wool, is placed on top. This is the moment of consumption. The torch is lit. Watch the fire catch. It starts with the wood, but soon it finds the fabric. The wool, which we saw sheared from the sheep, spun on the drop spindle, woven on the vertical loom, dyed with the blood of sea snails and bleached with sulfur. It begins to burn. Wool does not burn quickly. It smolders. It curls. It turns to black carbon. The structure of the weave, the grid of the tunic, the geometry of the toga, it all unravels in the heat. The expensive perfumes, the oils soaked into the skin and the cloth, catch fire. They burn with a bright, aromatic smoke. The scent of burning frankincense rises into the sky, carrying the spirit of the deceased to the winds. The gold rings, the fibula, holding the cloak, they do not burn, they melt. The intricate seal of the ancestor, the face of the lion or the god, softens and returns to a shapeless nugget of gold. All the complexity of Roman dress, the status, the gender, the power, the protection, is reduced to ash. Sinis. The white bone and the gray ash are collected. They are placed in an urn, perhaps a glass urn, delicate and blue, perhaps a marble urn carved with garlands. The urn is sealed, and in the later empire, when cremation gave way to burial, the clothing faced a slower fate. Laid in a sarcophagus of stone, the linen and wool would fight a losing battle against time. The linen would disintegrate first, turning to dust. The wool would last longer, perhaps centuries in the right conditions, but eventually it too would fade. Only the gold threads of the toga picta or the leather soles of the caligae might remain, ghostly outlines of a person who once walked the Via Appia. So we end where we began. We started with the raw wool on the sheep's back, warm and alive. We end with the dust in the cold stone jar. But between those 2 points, what a spectacle it was. The shimmer of the silk in the candlelight, the crunch of the hobnailed boots on the road, the snap of the heavy toga in the wind, the smell of the sulfur in the laundry, the rattle of the pearl earrings. It was a world built of fabric, a world where you could read a man's life by the stripe on his chest and the shoe on his foot. Now, the wardrobe is closed, the chest is locked, the history is folded away. Close your eyes. Let the heavy wool blanket cover you. Let the darkness of the toga pull a wrap around the world. The noise is gone. The empire is asleep. And so are you. Sleep. 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 If this journey through the duller side of history helped you unwind and maybe even drift off, please let me know. First, hit that like button if you enjoyed this historical lullaby. Second, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future installments of history too boring to keep you awake. Finally, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below about which historical topic you find so mundane. It deserves to be our next sleepy video. Your suggestions will shape our journey into the world's most delightfully dull past.